Good evening and welcome to this inaugural lecture by Professor Ahuvia Kahane, the Regius Professor of Greek here at Trinity. We're very pleased that so many of you came here this evening, especially as it was such a bright, beautiful day in Dublin. But it is really, really special to be here in person. This is only our second inaugural in person over the last 2 years, so it is a very, very special occasion. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gail McElroy and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences. A particular warm welcome this evening to the Provost, Dr. Linda Doyle, also to several other college officers who are here, the Vice Provost, Professor Orla Shields, and the Senior Lecturer, Professor David Shepherd. We also have the Head of the School of Histories and Humanities, Christine Morris, and Acting Head of Classics, Hazel Dodge. We're really, really pleased to be joined by Her Excellency, Mrs. Charis Christodoulou, Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus to Ireland, and Her Excellency, Mrs. Ekaterina Simopoulou, Ambassador of the Hellenic Republic to Ireland. And we also have some former post holders of the Regius Professor with us, John Dillon and Brian McGee. So welcome to you all. But an especially warm welcome to Ahuvia's friends and family, some of whom have travelled to be here tonight, his wife Georgina and son Erasmus, and his mother-in-law, whose name, unfortunately, I don't know. So for those of you for whom this is the first inaugural, a little background. Inaugural lectures are significant, very significant events in an academic staff member's career, and they're given by all newly appointed professors. It's an opportunity to showcase their research to the college community and members of the public. At Trinity, this is a ceremonial occasion, which is why I'm wearing the Harry Potter gown, as is Ahuvia. A bit of background on the Regius Chair of Greek. It was founded in 1761, so if you can do the maths, 261 years ago, and is the 9th oldest chair in the university, and one of only 4 Regius professorships that we have currently. A Regius professorship is a university professorship who has or originally had royal patronage or appointment. They're a unique feature of academia in the UK and Ireland, and the University of Dublin in particular, and they're instituted in disciplines that are judged to be fundamental. The Queen makes these appointments still in the United Kingdom, not here obviously, as we're an independent sovereign state, but it is. But this royal imprimatur is an indication, and the relative rarity of these professorships means a Regius professorship is particularly prestigious and highly sought after. The first incumbent was Theodore Wilder of Castle Wilder, who was tutor to both Oliver Goldsmith and Edmund Burke, and he was known for his savage temper, apparently, so hope that has not passed down the lineage. Ahuvia. The 9th incumbent, Frank Sadlier, was Provost of Trinity College, Dublin, and the 16th incumbent, Ran, William Bedell Stanford, failed in his bid to be appointed as Provost. Ahuvia assures us he has no sights on number 1 Grafton Street. Ahuvia also has the Leventis Chair of Greek Culture, which was established in 2017. He's the first incumbent, and it has been funded through the generosity of the Leventis Foundation and the Leventis family, who are renowned for their support of Greek culture worldwide, and we'd like to acknowledge their generosity here this evening. Now to the star of the show, Professor Ahuvia Kahane. He was born on a kibbutz in Israel and grew up in Jerusalem and Berkeley. He completed his BA at the University of Tel Aviv in 1984, and he completed his PhD at Balliol College in Oxford in 1990 under the supervision of Jasper Griffin. Before joining Trinity in 2019, he held positions in the University of Oxford, Harvard, Northwestern, and Royal Holloway. Ahuvia is a philologist whose areas of interest include ancient Greek and Latin literature and culture, modern philosophy, the politics of form, the sociology of learning, visual studies, and the relationship between ancient and modern literature and thought. So, a true Renaissance man, Ahuvia. He's published extensively on early Greek poetry and Homer, and he has also developed the Chicago Homer, a digital research tool that attracts millions of hits annually. And he has also published 9 scholarly books. And not a man to rest on his laurels, he's currently completing a book on the relations between literary form and historical time, a book on the ethics and poetics of early Greek hexameter, And he's also, rather topically, editing a book about the philosophy, public culture, and visual spaces and politics of walking in times of lockdown and restricted movement. So tonight he's going to talk to us on the Boar, the scholar, and the ethics of classical philology. And he will address such important questions as, can the study of ancient Greece really help us live a better life? Can we pursue an ethics of classics and philology? And in today's world, can the study of classical antiquity be ethical? And with that, I hand over to Professor Kahane. Thank you.
I will, with your permission, take off my mask. Thank you, Dean, for that overly generous introduction. I'll just get the PowerPoint running. Slideshow and from the beginning. You forgot to say that I'm an expert on boars, but in fact, I'm not. Provost, Dean, again, Vice Provosts, Your Excellency, the Ambassador of the Hellenic Republic in Ireland, Your Excellency, the Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus to Ireland, Head of School, Head of Department, thank you very much, eminent colleagues, esteemed guests, friends, and of course, family. There we go. One of my favorite modern artists. In the Queen's College in Oxford, there is a tradition, still very much alive, of serving boar's head at Christmas dinner. Because, so the story goes, once upon a time in the 14th century, a scholar of the college by the name of John Copcut, according to one version, was taking a stroll in nearby Begley Wood, or by some other account in Shotover Forest, reading, as one does, his Aristotle. In Greek, of course. As he was strolling through the bluebells among the trees, our scholar heard a rustle. Raising his eyes, he saw on the path, straight ahead of him, a white-tusked wild boar about to charge. With nothing but Aristotle to hand, the poor, bewildered scholar hurled his book at the boar and screamed, and I assume as much in fear as in utter intellectual frustration, and he did so in Latin, of course, Graecum est non potest legi. It's all Greek to me, and that, indeed, this story, so the story goes, is the origin of the expression. The boar lunged forward, tusks gleaming, bristles on end, mouth wide open, and, oh ill fate, swallowed Aristotle's tongue whole. Not surprisingly, perhaps, he then choked. I wonder whether he choked on the big book or on Aristotle's Greek, but he died. The scholar's life was saved. And the moral of the story? Ancient Greek, though perhaps as inscrutable to beasts as it is to man, is a thing that enfolds the mysteries, perhaps of both death and life. Well, hold on. Before we draw any firm conclusions about the meaning and value of ancient Greek, let's pause for reflection. And don't forget, it's Shrove Tuesday today. Though I beg you to indulge my porcine fantasy just a moment longer, let's not forget that it's Mardi Gras today as well. My endpoint, I should assure you, is not simply to tell an animal fable, but as with animal fables, generally to speak of philosophy and ethics. According to our story, both scholar and boar, it would seem, had some difficulty, let's say, digesting ancient Greek. But imagine that by some miraculous turn of intellect, the pig and the man, were enlightened in the arts of classical philology. Philo, love, or the study of logos, ancient language, and thought. And so the two might have sat down together to consider their arboreal encounter in a more scholarly and humane manner, perhaps by actually reading Aristotle's philosophy rather than weaponizing his book. After all, since antiquity and for millennia, and perhaps even today, Aristotle, generally known simply as, I couldn't resist that slide, humans and pigs sitting together and discussing Aristotle, the philosopher. Aristotle was one of the pillars of life in Western traditions of science, metaphysics, poetics, politics, and ethics. And as Aristotle famously suggests in the Politics, for example, man and beast do have something in common. Many of you will know that Aristotle defines man as a political animal, a politikon zoon, by nature, physei, as in the modern physics. Man, Aristotle explains, lives in social polities, in which every being has a special end. In Greek we say, Aristotle says, a telos, a purpose in the good harmonies of the world, and again, the politics. Every polity is a sort of partnership. In Greek, a koinonia, and every partnership is formed with a view to some good. The world is a well-ordered place. And here again is Mark Dion, who deals often with Aristotle, and you can see a highly structured and elegant installation. Fair enough, says our sapient pig. I couldn't resist that slide as well. Fair enough, says the pig to his new human friend. What, he asks then, is my good end in the harmony of our partnership? To which the scholar, had he known any Greek, might have again quoted Aristotle and said, and this is from the Politics again, clearly we must suppose that, quote, by nature plants exist for the sake of animals, we can understand that, and other animals for the good of man, the domestic species, both for his service and for his food, and if not all, at all events, most of the wild animals, perhaps like our boar, for the sake of his food and his supplies of other kind. So the boar now understands. Here is a 14th century Mycenaean helmet made of boar's tusk, and just think of how many boars sacrificed their lives for the sake of this partnership. The boar now understands that the partnership exists to good end, and his place in that partnership, according to nature, and forgive me, this is Aristotle, not me, his role is to be killed and to die and to be served up as dinner on the scholar's table, perhaps as in the University of Oxford. Now I have to switch, and this is a recording, and let's see if we can play this.
The boar's head in hand where I be dead.
The ceremony continues, and we will stop it here. And here, as you can see, things might begin to become a little more ethically uncomfortable. As Aristotle at least sees it, the pig being an inferior being and lacking the reason of mankind should know that when he had charged a superior human animal in Begley Wood, he had in fact committed an offense against nature itself, where a truly intelligent beast would have offered himself to the slaughter to be eaten by man, his partner, his master, and his very, very good friend. Well, let me say here nothing more about the question of humans and animals, though it is a topical question these days. But at this point, other more general ethical questions emerge for anyone who feels that they might have a cultural affinity with the Greeks, and indeed we have a very close cultural affinity with the Greeks because we are all speakers of Greek. Think of philosophy, think of democracy, think of politics, think of poetics. The list is very long indeed. Aristotle, the philosopher, let me remind you again, guided the science, morals, and good purposeful order of the West for millennia. And crucially, he sought unity, purpose, and reason in everything. His view of the relations between humans and animals, for example, was part of a rigorously structured overall worldview that defined what later in the Middle Ages was known as the Scala Naturae, the ladder of nature, setting out a clear and complete hierarchy between inferior beings driven by appetites, lower appetites and emotions, and superior beings guided by reason. And so, according to Aristotle, a world of masters and subjects. One that can foresee with his mind is naturally ruler and naturally master, and one that can carry out labor with his body is subject and naturally a slave. I think that we might begin to see the difficulty, which only gets bigger, and I should perhaps add a trigger warning here, again from the politics, as between the sexes, the male is by nature, physei, superior, and the female inferior, the male ruler and the female subject. Well, I'm not sure that, certainly I don't agree with that, and I'm sure everyone in this room would not entirely agree with it. But this is Aristotle. And the same must also necessarily apply in the case of mankind. Generally, those men that differ as widely as the soul from the body and the human being from the lower animal, these are by nature slaves, for whom to be governed by this kind of authority is advantageous. For he is by nature, so the slave should enjoy his slavery, for he is by nature a slave who is capable of belonging to another. Well, I assume that anyone who thinks of our cultural ancestry, as indeed without any doubt we carry, should now be thinking of this. Though I must apologize to everyone in the room. Having started out with light-hearted tales about rushing pigs and flying books and ignorant scholars in the woods, I seem to have, despite my intention to, or ambition to entertain, come to a rather heavy moral and historical reflection on Greek and on what we might here call the ethics of philology. Could we not then, by way of remedy, at least for a while, look elsewhere, look to the beauty of classical literature and the immediacy of its sublime material form, to the enchanting music of ancient Greek, perhaps to the music of the Homeric poems. So here, for example, are the first lines of the first book of the Iliad by Homer, a book that I've been reading for the last 30 years. They are the very first words of European literature, as the great Ernst Robert Curtius defined them. And you can follow along with me. This is Homer in this slide, because the first line has the Greek. Then, if you can't read the Greek characters, there is the Greek transliterated and then a translation. And I will read these 5 lines for you, with your permission, in the Greek. Meninaidethea pelea dio Achilleos ulomenein hemiriakaios algeeteke polas diptimus psychas aidi proiapsen heroon autuste heloria teuke kinesin oionoisiti passi dios de teleetobule. Of course, these verses too outline some rather violent emotions and actions. The Iliad is the story, after all, of the anger of Achilles, and it is a narrative of killing. Here's one of my favorite modern pieces of art. This is a huge canvas by the great Cy Twombly in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where there are 10 enormous canvases that outline the Iliad, and you can see how violent it is, how phallic it is, how scribbled it is. 10 magnificent canvases in their own room in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And here's another extremely beautiful and violent canvas from that series. But it's the same, of course, with antiquity and this magnificent amphora from Athens. But should we not, at least sometimes, given that it's so violent, seek solace in the music of antiquity, allowing the painful meanings of the actual Greek words to remain all Greek to us? Or could we not, even in the Iliad, seek a gentler moment? So here, for example, is a passage from Book 6 of the poem, where the great Trojan warrior Hector here and his wife Andromache, his beloved wife Andromache, and their beloved baby son Astyanax are conversing in an intimate family scene. Listen to the music again. I'll read just 8 lines. Daimonie me moitilie nakakidze o tumo, ugartisme hyperaisan aner ID projapsen, moirand utina femi, pepygmenon emmenai andron, ukakon udemen estlon, epenta protagenetai. And the second 4 lines, al eis oikoniusa, tas autis erga comidge, histon e lacatente, kai antipoloisica lewe ergon epoikestai, polemos, dandresi melesi, passi, malista demoi, to ilio engegaasi. Now, some of you may nevertheless ask, what do the Greek words in this loving scene when Hector speaks to his dear wife actually mean? Well, as before, here is the text, the transliteration, so that you can read what the Greek sounds like, and the translation. And I'm here helped by the translations from Homer of Emily Wilson, who is perhaps the first woman translator of the whole of these 2 great poems. Hector says, "Poor Andromache, don't feel sorry for me in your heart. No one is going to hurl me down to Hades unless it is fated. And as for fate, I don't think that anyone has yet escaped it. Not a coward, not a nobleman, once things start to roll." Andromache has just said, you're going to get yourself killed. I'm going to become a war prize. I'm going to be enslaved. And, says Hector, but you go in and do your work. Stick to the loom and the distaff. Tell your slaves to do their chores as well. It is for men to fight, especially for me. I am the master. Homer was, of course, the teacher of the Greeks. What's more, I should tell you that these lines, like almost all lines in Homer, are made up of highly repetitive elements. They are what Homer scholars call traditional formulae. And here in the slide, this is the second part. But you go to fight, especially for me, I am master. So, as I said, the lines are highly repetitive, and I've marked the repetitions both in the Greek and in the translation. And it's a technical thing, which I won't go into, but you can see how highly repetitive the text is. These repetitions are called traditional formulae because, according to the theory of oral composition, they express traditional ideas in traditional form. A bit like, perhaps, in early Irish oral verse. This is our friend, the church dove, St. Columba. Or, in a more crude and basic example, a bit like Lego blocks. The ready-made bits that make it possible for oral poets, like Homer or the Homeric tradition in cultures where white writing did not exist, to perform very long poems in the very process of singing them and compose them as you sing them for audiences without the use of text. And with changes, we can see living evidence of this. Here is a recording made at the beginning of the last century by the great. So we create out of Lego blocks these Lego worlds, and then the recording. Let me just show you how repetitive it is. This is there's a lot of scholarship on this. It's highly analogous. This is the great Avdo Medjedevich singing a long oral epic poem in what used to be the former Yugoslavia. So let's think again about the contents of the verses we've just recited. Hector may love his dear wife, but he certainly knows how to put her in her place as a woman. It is for men to fight, especially for me. I am master. He then is the master, she is his wife and subject who must do as the master says and stay in her rooms. So we can, I think, begin to understand where Aristotle might have found some of his ideas, which he later developed into a system. So far, what we see is that at the very cradle of Western civilization, in classical antiquity, slumber some, let's call them cultural babies that are not always quite so cute. Morally speaking, perhaps our friends, the scholar and the Boar in Begley Wood, didn't do quite so badly. Perhaps it is better to live or die in ignorance of the meaning of Aristotle's philosophical Greek, or even Homer's Greek poetry, than live by the values of the meaning of these words. And so we have to seriously ask ourselves today, how should we live with our Greek past? And in what remains of my presentation here today, I would like to hazard an answer. The first part of my answer has to do with basic scientific and methodological principles, with the diverse and unpredictable, in science we say stochastic, I'll explain that in a moment, and ever-changing fundamentals of nature, of language, of cognition, of tradition, and of traditionality. The problem, let me remind you, is that Homer's language, for example, and his ideas were not just ad hoc, but were in fact formulaic, repetitive, and traditional. So Hector treats Andromache perhaps as a master treats a subject, and such harshness may be representative of the ideas of a wider culture. And centuries later, Aristotle develops that into a philosophical system, defining the general relations between masters and slave and subjects. But is Homer's language, indeed any language, truly repetitive and traditional? Is it truly subject to fixed general laws, let's say laws of grammar and syntax and semantics? Laws that, if they were in place, would indeed repress any freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and perhaps even free will itself. There are, of course, many distinct grammatical and syntactic patterns in every and any language, which is, after all, thank you, Gertrude Stein, repetitive. A rose is a rose is a rose. Yet, even this sentence, we know that by simply repeating the exact same words, we can express new. We speak in everyday language. We create new ideas from exactly the same units. And the question which we face, which I face as a philologist, as a student of ancient Greece, is how can we do that? How scientifically can we understand and explain the paradox of creating new things from units that do not change or do not seem to change? I should tell you that some of the most influential, I won't go into technical details, but some of the most influential linguists in the world today and in the past, William Croft, Charles Fillmore, Talmy Gibbon, more recently Adele Goldberg, or Michael Tomasello, or Joan Baby, and many others, have argued persuasively that linguistic patterns are, first, not general, but local. They're always tied to their specific context. Two, not universally subject to laws, but merely describing words in use. We call them, in linguistics, constructions. It's a technical term. These constructions are, forgive me for using the rigid philosophical term, epiphenomenal. That is to say, they are not part of the phenomenon of reality itself. They follow on from that after the fact. And third, linguistic constructions are inherently complex stochastic interaction, where stochastic means that they have a random pattern, a random distribution pattern that we could analyze but not predict exactly. We can never calculate these patterns, and we could simply say, how would poetry ever exist if we thought that we could? Now, methodologically and philosophically, arguments of this kind are in fact based on hard science, both empirical and theoretical. Some of these key principles, and I don't have time to go through this in detail, you wouldn't want me to go through this in detail, they're not identical, but they do share principles, and I'm not a scientist by training, but nonetheless, forgive me for the reductive whistle-stop tour of contemporary science. You find them in quantum physics, in the phenomenon of entanglement. Forgive this simplistic representation, but quantum entanglement confutes time and space in manners that do precisely that. In diffractive patterns, we find them in principles of uncertainty. The name Werner Heisenberg might mean something to a lot of you in the audience. In the thought experiments about the cat by our friend Erwin Schrödinger, who thought there was a multiplicity there. And of course, we know that Schrödinger lived his life with very practical multiplicity, with his many, two, I think, wives, in Dublin right here. We find them in thermodynamics. This is a rough diagram of cells, convection cells, called Bénard cells, which the Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Ilya Prigogine, talks about a lot. We find them in mathematics. Again, I won't certainly go into that. In Gödel's theorem of incompleteness and otherwise. We find them perhaps most popularly in the arguments by mathematician and meteorologist Edward Lorenz from the 60s about the butterfly, the little butterfly flapping its wings, and then a tsunami emerging on the other end of the world. And the principle, and I put it here in absurdly reductive terms, is that very small changes, perhaps the butterfly, can produce large and unpredictable effects. And methodologically, I have to tell you, it is, in principle at least, exactly the same in language. So here is Claire Cramps, a Berkeley linguist, and she says about complexity, which is the underlying general phenomenon, although reductively stated. And she says about language. When you learn one additional piece of knowledge, this new knowledge doesn't just add itself to other things. you acquired previously, the equilibrium you thought you had reached in your prior state of knowledge gets disrupted every time as one new piece of knowledge reconfigures the whole picture. Now, this idea, let me tell you, has immediate practical application in, for example, interpreting ancient Greek texts. Let me give you an example. I've suggested to you that in Homer's Iliad, many phrases are repeated, traditional formulae. And so Hector, the great warrior, here he is again with Andromache and their son, may indeed at one point say to his dear wife, "You go in and do your work, I am the master." And in Book 6 of the Iliad, this expression may well mark, let's call it the tragedy of heroic death and male heroes' relations to their wives. But we absolutely must not think of these expressions as let's call it an equilibrium of meaning or ideas, as a fixed state of repeated concepts. Why not? Because, for example, exactly the same phrase is repeated in the Odyssey. This is a drinking vessel from Attica. Exactly the same words are repeated by Telemachus, here standing, and his mother Penelope. And in the first book of the Odyssey, Telemachus' young and helpless son says to his wise mother the exact same words. And in Greek, it's even more distinct. "You go in and do your work, I am the master." And part of the Chicago Homer, this digital project, is precisely that it marks every single type of repetition for the whole of these almost 17 or 27,000 lines of Homer and then other poems. But remember, this is Telemachus, a helpless young man speaking to his mother. And here, let me suggest to you, these very words, because he is so helpless, actually mark something of the comedy of male claims to, the absurdity of male claims to mastery. In the Odyssey, the age of heroes, chest-thumping heroes like Hector perhaps, and Achilles, and this is already Homer at the very earliest stage of Greek culture, is coming to an end. And Odysseus' young and helpless son Telemachus, although he will not die, he will live partly because of the cunning of the very woman whom he bosses around and says, "You go in and do your work, I am the master." And precisely the exact same repetition is what changes everything. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but repetition brings out difference, precisely indeed as in science. If we take this view, then every repetition is free from its own past. And where there is freedom in precise repetition, there is choice. And where there is choice, and we could go on about this in great philosophical lengths, which we won't, of course, this evening, you'll be happy to hear. Where there is choice, there is ethical responsibility. And indeed, if we listen to the Iliad, for example, philologically, then we might find that this poem does always change. And alongside with Hector's male-dominant declarations, for example, we find that the last words, almost literally the last words, in the Iliad are given over not to men, but to women. Indeed, not even to Greek women, but to Trojan women, that is to say to, let's call them, as the Greeks did, barbarian women. Women who do not speak, they go bar, not the Greek language. That's where the word comes from. The Iliad ends with 3 great speeches. The last word is given over to women. Hecuba, Hector's mother, the woman who gave this man life. Andromache, Hector's wife, the woman who shared her life with this man. And finally, Helen, the woman on whose account Hector's life comes to an end. So by the end of the Iliad, that foundational, let's now call it, masterwork of ancient Greek male values, Homer and the Greeks and we ourselves may be looking at the world from a woman's point of view. Perhaps even from a non-Greek woman's point of view. And this world is paradoxically, let's call it, all Greek, already to the most Greek of Greeks themselves. The point is this. The world of Homer and the world of Aristotle and the world of ancient Greece and ancient Greek and of philology has not one but always many changing perspectives. And from such perspectives come what we might call a cultural or poetic or philosophical or moral depth. We could call it a cultural parallax. After all, we see depth with our eyes precisely because we have two eyes, not one, and we see different pictures, a little bit at least, in each eye. It's precisely by noting not consistency, but and repetition as we might otherwise understand it, but the intractable scholarly paradoxes and ambiguities of these repeated words that strangely perhaps we gain a multifaceted image of the ancient world, perhaps thus an understanding of diversity and a better understanding of history and maybe even of ourselves today. I started this talk with a little story about a charging boar in the woods. And it is only fitting that I should begin to draw this talk to a conclusion with a story about another boar in the woods. This is a rather cute boar, in fact. This story illustrates and perhaps stresses my point. And here it is, as it is told in the 19th book of Homer's Odyssey. For those of you who want it, lines 391. So, when he was a young boy, Odysseus, the hero, the great hero of the Odyssey, and also appearing heroically in the Iliad, of course. But when he was a young boy, he went to visit his maternal grandfather, Autolycus. Autolycus takes the young Odysseus boar hunting in the forests of Mount Parnassus. Mount Parnassus, I would remind you, is home to the Muses, so it's a very poetic kind of boar hunt. Anyway, they spot the beast, and it is a huge boar, with hair bristling on his back and glaring fire in his eyes. Phrixas eulofien, pur d'ophthalmoisi de dorcos. Pure fire. Ophthalmoisi, as in ophthalmology. We're all Greeks. We all speak Greek today. Odysseus prepares to cast his spear, eager to wound the pig, but the pig was quicker and struck him above the knee, tearing far through his flesh with a tooth, jerking sideways. As in the previous story, the pig here is on the attack. And this narrative, of course, is not a tale about scholars and obscure written books by Aristotle or anybody else. It is about the youth of a great hero, a warrior, intellectual, but a warrior nonetheless. Yet I would submit to you that there is a kind of Greek writing in this scene. The pig inscribes his mark on Odysseus' body. It leaves a deep scar on Odysseus' leg, I tried to find the most innocuous picture of a scar that I could. There were plenty of really gory ones, but I thought I would spare you that. So it's more serious than that, but for the sake of our lecture. Now, like all scars, this scar, let me suggest to you, is an illegible sign. It's a sign that cannot be read in the way we read language. I can't look up the meaning of a scar in a dictionary of scars. There is no dictionary of scars. It is an inherently illegible sign. I might almost say in good Latin, of course. Cicatrix est, non potest legi. It's all a scar to me. In time, Odysseus' wound heals. Yet the boar's illegible sign, this scar, in Greek the word is oule, remains in the body. But here, ladies and gentlemen, is my point. The scar on Odysseus' leg is an indelible certain sign. In Homer and in ancient Greek, we call it a sema ariphrades, an absolute sign, a distinct sign. The scar, indeed, later becomes one of the crucial marks of identity for Odysseus, a mark of who he is in the present and then in the future. Odysseus' scar, let me suggest to you, is precisely that bit of writing, let's call it, from the painful experience of the past that is written on the body, that remains exactly what it is. Nothing more, nothing less. A scar is a scar is a scar. It is an illegible sign from the past that marks the present and the future. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus comes home, it is by this very scar that he got as a boy from the boar during his boar hunt with Autolycus, his maternal grandfather. It is this very scar that, for example, his old nursemaid, Euryclea, identifies and, startled and weeping, realizes that she is actually washing the feet of her old master. But at this point, Odysseus is no longer her master more than he is the little baby that she held in her arms that long time ago. And the scar is likewise the sign by which Odysseus' wife, the wise Penelope, and later Laertes, Odysseus' old father, recognize the hero when he has finally come home. Odysseus is the man of many ways. In Greek, polytropos, many tropes, many different ways. Not just ways of wandering, but ways of the mind and ways of presenting himself. He is many things to many different people. But all his different identities are united as one in this, let's call it an illegible sign, the scar on his body. And the moral of the story? Perhaps it is that such scars from our painful pasts, such Greek marks, that are always existentially, philosophically, ethically Greek to us. Those are signs that we can describe and observe with scientific precision, but that somehow always remain illegible, that always hide, let's call it a supplement, that are the marks of our many identities in the present and the future. And it is this moral of Odysseus' scar that, let me suggest, I keep with me as a lifelong student of ancient Greek. I am practicing, perhaps not philology, the study of the language and thought of antiquity, but if I may coin a phrase, remember oule is the Greek word for a scar. I am practicing oolology. A made-up word, of course. The study of scars from the Greek past, those illegible yet certain marks of our cultural wounds and our cultural pasts. And yet, marks from the past that also mark, I should think, our present and our future. And with such mutable, let's call them Greek scars, perhaps we can even revisit one day Aristotle and his troubling philosophical word to think them again. It is in such philology, the philology of historical scars, in oolology, if I may coin the word again, as I would submit, that the ethics of the study of ancient Greek and its diversity might reside. Thank you very much. Could you turn on the power after 45 minutes?
Great, thank you. Very riveting, and perhaps, whoops. Okay.
Does this make a...
Possibly. Okay, so that was riveting. Thank you very much, Ahuvia. We have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. Should anybody have a pressing question to make matters all a little less Greek to us? So, who's going to be first off? Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahuvia. Very, very interesting and very engaging. Quick question: Is really though what you're saying? Are we the sum of our experiences?
Sorry,
are we the sum of our experiences?
Are we the sum of our experiences?
Yeah.
Yes, except that we would never know what that sum is. In the sciences, we find very good examples of that. I don't want to get too scientific, and let's not forget, I am not a scientist by training. But one of the problems in the sciences that, for example, astronomers and physicists have been studying since antiquity is the relations and trying to predict the movements of the sun, the earth, and the moon, which are all around us. Mathematically, that's known as the three-body problem, which means if I know how the sun or the earth or the moon moves, if I know how the other body moves and the third body moves, I should be able to calculate, according to the simple laws of physics, where each one will be at any moment in time. Well, I'm not a mathematician, but mathematicians for the last several millennia, including most recently, we get great approximations so we can send astronauts to the moon, but we cannot calculate it with mathematical precision. And so if you ask, well, are we the sum of our experiences? Most certainly we are, as the sun, the moon, and the earth are the sum of their trajectories, masses, movements. But they are stochastic. That's the key word that I've been using. And it's there as much in thermodynamics and in quantum mechanics as it is, I would submit, and I have used it in writing in the study of language and the study of ancient Greek. And that's what makes it fun and exciting, in a sense. I don't always know what's there behind the curtain.
Right. Any more questions? Yes, the woman up the back. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lovely lecture. I wanted to ask, is the oolology a new entrance in the Babiniotis dictionary or in any dictionary? Are you producing a new dictionary?
I've written the dictionary myself, and I was working for many years with colleagues and friends in the great Oxford English Dictionary. And they had a myth or a plot or a conspiracy at that time. In order to get into the Oxford English Dictionary, you had to have 3 reputable written references. And if you could make up those references by somehow slipping it into a scholarly article, Gail, colleagues, then you have your reference. So I would say it's not there yet, but if any of our eminent scholars would care to use it, we may yet get there.
Excellent. The gentleman in the maroon jumper. Yes, you, yes?
Thanks very much. I have a question which I'm kind of formulating a question from a couple of passages which are very rich talk has kind of sparked in me. The question, and I'll give the passages after the question, but the question basically is, do you have any thoughts about are there particular faculties of the mind or strengths which a philologist should exemplify? So one passage I think of, when you talk about philology, from what I read, Socrates was the first person to use the term philolodos in the Phaedrus. Yeah. And of course, there's sort of a medical background there where the pharmacon which brings him out of the city is a speech. But Socrates, sort of the emblematic figure of dialectical reason, in the longer tradition. Just when you're with the woundings of the Boar, sure. I think of Nietzsche and going back to Homer and saying that to raise the ghosts of the past, or to raise the ghosts from the dead, namely to be a philologist, one has to spill blood, and presumably that's one's own blood, rather than the blood of your students. But just Nietzsche's, invocation of Homer in Book 11 of the Centimedia was used by no less than Villanovitz, with maybe a better pedigree as philologist in professional terms. Just in terms of your invocation of, as a philologist, of philology as oolology, does one have to bring maybe not dialectical reason, but personal experience and varied or polytropic experience? Or a different faculty, is it imagination? And you've mentioned all sorts of different disciplines here in your talk to illuminate mainly moments of Homer and study of language. So I was just wondering, between those three, could you elaborate more on your conception of philology, especially in the present age? That is not merely just a matter of memory.
Well, I think that's many questions. So, and I don't want to stand between people and a drink. So,
if you understand what I'm saying, it's one question.
Yeah. Like yourself, I am an avid reader of Sartre's Unfinished Critique of Dialectical Reason, and I learn from it every day almost. We'll leave that one just for the moment aside. Another great scholar of a very different ilk, Roman Jakobson, the linguist, once defined philology, and I would follow that, and I pass it on to my students, as the art of reading slowly. When you read slowly, things get complicated very quickly, and you realize that the slower you read, the longer the road. And the longer the road, the more things become unclear, open, and very exciting. So that's does that sort of begin to address the question? If not, we can discuss it at great length, but I would, how should I say, squander all the credit that I've earned so far if I started to answer that in earnest. So
one for over a drink.
I'll stop here.
Yes, or a lecture. And one final question. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Professor. Wonderful talk. I don't read Greek, but it's something that struck me was I was reading the introduction to a long poem, work by Anne Carson. I don't know if it was Red Doc or something of that type, but it's the fantastical revising about the dragon and the labours.
Poet and the scholar.
And a poet and a Greek scholar. Yes, a translator. And she writes about how the ancient Greeks connected adjectives to nouns very strongly, fused them together, like in the Iliad. I can't remember them precisely, but something like clear-eyed Athena or bronze-armed Hector or something like that. And I wondered if that connection, that fusing between adjective and noun is also part of this power of repetition, if you could touch upon that aspect.
I'm tempted to give the short answer. No. But the reason, and I'll spend maybe just 20 seconds here, is that those linguists that I mentioned, Adele Goldberg, Michael Tomasello at the Max Planck, Joan Baby, a whole range of scholars who are known as cognitive, they are modern linguistics who, in many ways, linguists who in many ways object to the very distinction which we sometimes think of, Chomsky, for example, thinks of as universal, between, he says, okay, everybody has nouns, adjectives, verbs, pronouns, conjunctions. It's been demonstrated both empirically and theoretically by cognitive functional linguists and by many others that not all languages have these categories. So did the Greeks have those? Well, we'd have to go very deeply into the early Greek grammarians, and they are relatively late, or try to read Homer as a grammarian, or read some of the early philosophers as grammarians, to even try to answer that question. But instinctively, the short answer would be, they don't have these distinctions, they just speak. A baby, here we get into complex linguistic questions, at age 3, without having studied language academically, without having any knowledge of the formalities of the kind of things that we scholars, that I spend my time sometimes, and many of my colleagues, analyzing in great technical detail. And yet, a baby, a child of 3, can speak grammatically, not because perhaps he or she have an innate grammar in their head, as Chomsky would say, but simply because he sees a caveman sees another caveman saying ugh, ugh, and by that maybe they mean what a delicious shank of roast boar. And so they imitate, and they would say ugh, ugh, but as they imitate they may change. They might think, this roast boar shank is maybe a little overdone. I prefer it a little rare, medium rare, so to say. Things change. That's a short answer to a very long, and thank you for the question.
Great, thank you all so much. That was a great talk, and I learned a lot. Thank you very much, Ahuvia. I'd like to thank Valerie and Jade in particular, for organising this event this evening. Also, thank you to everyone for coming. It's heartening to see so many people here. Thank you to the Provost, Their Excellencies, the Ambassadors of Greece and Cyprus. And finally, Professor Kahane, we are honoured by that talk. And now, to celebrate this evening, please join us for a drink or two, perhaps in the senior common room that's over above the dining hall. Just follow the crowds. Thank you very much. Thank you.